What is a vampire? In their most basic form, vampires are creatures that live off the life force of others. They're not just predators, they're predators of humans. They usually aren't portrayed as mindless monsters in the Forbidden Wilds. They're infiltrators of human society who sacrifice good, innocent folk for their sustenance, and sometimes for their excess. Vampires have an interesting place in history, and the vampires of any given era tend to reflect that era's people, their fears, superstitions, and even their understanding of medicine and science. I like to think of them not just as frightening monsters and Halloween decorations, but as a fascinating part of literary history. See, it's not a big logical jump to think that a lot of typical vampiric attributes were probably attempts to explain natural phenomena. Say you're a poor serf farmer working to feed the noble family that owns your land. You see that people around you are getting sick, fatigue, chills, weight loss. Now some of them are dying, and without any obvious wounds. You don't know what's happening, and it terrifies you. Since no one's invented disease ecology just yet, you think that maybe there's some creature out there killing people, preying on your friends and family. You don't see anything too dangerous in the day, so perhaps it slinks around at night, where candles are scarce and everyone goes to bed around sunset. Other villagers, desperate for answers, cling to yours as the only explanation. Children tell the story to scare each other. You start having nightmares about the creature, your imagination filling in the gaps. And it gets worse. Sometimes you put a body in the ground, but because you weren't quite educated enough to take a pulse, the poor soul tries to claw their way out of the coffin. You pop the lid to find scratch marks inside, and oh no! The corpse has risen from the dead! Maybe that's what's killing everyone, leaving big bite marks on their neck, which is one of the few bits of skin ever exposed when you're in bed asleep. At this point, maybe a priest gets involved, the sickness dies down a bit, and years down the line, when everyone tells travelers and their children about that strange rash of deaths way back when, the tale of the vampire sticks in everyone's minds. This kind of story is actually a plot point in the novella Carmilla. Young women of the village are dying of mysterious causes, and the culprit is discovered to be none other than the title vampire herself. Elements of vampire folklore come from all sorts of practices and mythologies, but the archetypal vampire stories that establish the genre, Carmilla, Dracula, the Vampire, have a few peculiarities in common. The vampires here tend to be rich, dwelling in castles or mansions like nobles. They also act selfishly, taking the lives and livelihood of their helpless victims as it suits them, like parasites, and again, like nobles. In fact, you could easily read a lot of classic vampire fiction as scathing allegories of the nobility, or the rich, and the control they have over their citizenry. I'd go so far as to say that vampires were intentionally written as a political allegory, which I hope to demonstrate for you going forward. Imagine you're that same poor serf from before. The nobles you serve, if you ever see them, seem healthy and well-fed compared to everyone around you. Your fellow villagers live in the shadow of death, but the nobles, who are probably hiding their sick folk up in the mansions, seem to be thriving. Now, say you get a cozy job working in your lord's estate. The lord looks an awful lot like those other paintings on the wall. Maybe because the lord is inbred to hell or styles himself after an ancestor, but it's more interesting to imagine that the lord is the same as the subject of his paintings, that it's the same man this whole time dominating your countryside for generations. Indeed, Carmilla brings up something similar. Laura sees a painting of Countess Mircalla Karnstein that strangely resembles her mysterious friend Carmilla, and, spoiler alert, turns out they're the same person. In the mid-18th century, years before the release of those stories I mentioned, Voltaire pointed out how, in the past, vampires were less known as hideous creatures in cemeteries. They were lords, businessmen, rulers. In the original Dracula novel, the initial protagonist Jonathan Harker goes to meet Count, a rank of landowner of course, Dracula, in order to support his purchasing real estate, and Dracula hatches a plot to take over all of England with this new land as his cornerstone. Carmilla claims to be descended from nobility. Lord Riven from The Vampire is a suave and mysterious British nobleman. Louis de Pontelac from Interview with the Vampire, released in 1976 but carrying the metaphor on, is a plantation and slave owner. Karl Marx had fun with his interpretation. He described capital as dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, drawing a direct and scathing parallel between the rich and our favorite pop culture bloodsuckers. Classical vampires are extraordinarily privileged, even without their supernatural advantages over mankind. longevity, animal transformations, getting to sleep in all day. Vampires are essentially nobles with a few malignant features exaggerated. They live a long time and for generations, thriving off the sacrifices and wealth of their thralls, dominating their lives, killing them when desired, and claiming unwilling lovers from their masses. See, now we get into a particularly uncomfortable part of the legend. Sexuality is a common element of vampire literature, where vampires have historically been portrayed as deviant, alluring, manipulative, and horribly dangerous to their victims. For instance, the portrayal of Carmilla as having a sexual and murderous interest in Laura reflects the deeply homophobic views of 19th century Europe. Carmilla leaves a trail of young women dead in her wake, and it's ambiguous as to whether she sees Laura more as a lover or as a meal. Carmilla is charming, but revealed to be suspicious and frightening. She's alluring and powerful, not in rank but in personality, and she tries to use that power to entice Laura into vulnerability. She's one in a long line of seductresses throughout literature: the Enchantress Morgan Le Fay, the Sirens, Lady Macbeth, Poison Ivy, who charm and seduce men into disastrous ideas or outright danger. The protagonist triumphs, when he or she does so, by resisting those charms and proving themselves above them, while the woman's forwardness is treated as deviant and dangerous. In other words, the man is portrayed heroically for resisting temptation, while the woman is demonized for being sexual and assertive. Vampires are not opposed to taking their sexual power in horrifying directions. In Dracula, the plight of Lucy Westenra and Mina Harker sees the Count sneaking into their bedrooms at night, regardless of the precautions taken by their loved ones, in what could easily be taken as an allegory for rape. Some classic vampires actually have hypnosis, letting them manipulate and control their conquests instead of having to use force. And here we can easily find another connection to nobility. Imagine again that you're that poor serf, and the noble has taken a tour of town and finds you attractive. There's really not a lot you can do to stop the Lord's guards from whisking you away to his manor that night, and he may even ply you with drinks and try to convince you that it's an honor to grace his bedchamber. So for the common folk, even if the vampire isn't irresistible, he's inescapable. Anne Rice's interview with the vampire plays with this idea of vampires being sensually dangerous. The novel is filled with instances of various vampires, and even the sympathetic protagonist Louis, seducing victims, fawning over beautiful women, men, and children they prey upon and murder. This is taken in another gross direction with the film Bram Stoker's Dracula, released in 1992 and starring Gary Oldman. It's a pretty good film, but I've never liked how they flipped the script on Dracula. Soon after Dracula nearly kills Jonathan Harker, he develops a romance with Jonathan's wife Mina. In the novel, Mina is an enemy and victim of Dracula's, and the invasive mental link he places upon her serves to be his undoing. But in the 1992 film, Dracula has turned against God because his wife Elisabetta is sent to hell for committing suicide, and Mina is Elisabetta's reincarnation or something. Mina and Dracula actually share a kiss in a chapel before she gives him peace by chopping his head off, so he can ascend to heaven and be with Elisabetta once again. Meanwhile, the whole parasite, murderer, evil noble idea is shelved in favor of portraying Dracula as a tragic monster who just wants to be with his love. Twilight continues this nasty trend. Edward Cullen is at first portrayed as hungry for Bella's blood, then as utterly devoted to her, despite how he, as an immortal, rich, attractive, invincible Adonis, has a ton more power than her in the relationship, and despite how abusive their relationship turns out to be. Edward stalks Bella, sneaks into her bedroom at night, isolates her from her loved ones, makes important decisions for her, breaks things, and this is portrayed as mysteriously romantic, or at worst complex, rather than manipulative and disgusting. I personally like vampires more as antagonists than protagonists. I like the approach the Castlevania series takes, where Dracula, Carmilla, and others are portrayed as downright stereotypical villains who live in massive castles, practice dark magic, and turn into horrific and monstrous forms. I like the anime Shiki, where for every one vampire bemoaning the curse cast upon them, 10 more are gleefully hunting down their former relatives and enemies. An approach I don't prefer, but still really enjoy, can be found in works like Tokyo Ghoul, which is a vampire story in all but name. Throughout modern-day Japan, the ghouls, including the protagonist, are people who can only survive by eating human flesh. A lot of them don't want to, and they find compromises with varying degrees of success. Some of the ghouls hunt humans, but still have human loved ones that they have to protect from the other ghouls. And significantly, a government organization hires operatives who hunt these ghouls, often with more cruelty and violence than the ghouls perform when eating to survive. The story sees the protagonist trying to make peace between humans and ghouls, trying to intervene in a war where villains exist on both sides. This is about as far as can be from classic vampire folklore, but it and other stories like it take motifs of the genre, people who hide among society while eating members of society, and put them in an all-new context and setting, with really fun, dark fantasy and horror stories as the result. One interesting take on vampires I've enjoyed is Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the excellent book by Seth Grahame-Smith, not the poor film adaptation. Vampire Hunter came out in 2010, yet the vampires within align more with 19th century vampires like Dracula and Carmilla. The vampires are murderers who kill much of Lincoln's family throughout the novel, and he eventually discovers that vampires have been buying slaves so they can keep them as food. Furthermore, the entire institution of American slavery, one historically maintained by landowners and businessmen, pretty much exists in the novel to keep vampires fed with fresh, helpless victims. One heroic vampire is Henry Sturgis, who is well aware of his privilege as a vampire and how other vampires abuse those privileges, and who saves Lincoln and becomes his lifelong ally against the more villainous undead. The portrayal of vampires has slipped this way and that throughout the years. Stories like Twilight and Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles have dominated our culture in the last few decades, and in general, the popular portrayal of vampires is alternated between cheesy horror cliches and mysteriously sensual, if dangerous, lovers. I've enjoyed stories like this before, as long as they don't portray abusive relationships as sexy. But in this era, where plenty would argue that our United States has turned into an oligarchy with an ever-widening gap between the rich and poor, I think there's still room for stories that portray vampires as greedy, manipulative, murderous, blood-sucking fiends. And I think there's still plenty of life in that allegory, simple and heavy-handed though it is. I can find plenty of examples of vampiric entities just watching the news.